Hi, good evening, everybody. We are back here for another installment of Back to the Past. We're live here on Facebook, and we're live here at the South Euclid Library in Cleveland, Ohio, or South Euclid, Ohio, and we're ready to rock and roll with another class. By the way, I have to apologize. At the end of last class, we turned off the screen before we let questions. If you are watching on Facebook, you can put in questions and I will see them. So when we get to the point of questions at the end, don't worry. You can type in your questions and hopefully we will be able to answer them. So anyhow, once again, this is Back to the Past, and we're covering all of Jewish history. We started last week with creation, and this week we're moving up to talk about the Patriarchs. And our goal is that tonight we'll cover the whole story of the Patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the goal of this whole course, or series, if you will, is to be able to cover all of Jewish history. So here we go. We'll pick up right where we left off. So at the end of last week, we were speaking about the flood in the first 2,000 years, Tower of Babel, all those things that happened. And right in the midst of this time period, we have the birth of Abraham. Avram is born in the Jewish year 1948, and that corresponds to the secular year 1813 before the Common Era. Now that is before the Tower of Babel. That is when many of these things are going on. He is born into quite a world, we will say. Now, before we jump into Abraham, it's important to throw in really the perspective on our forefathers. And true, the question is asked by Rashi as to why the Torah even includes the story of our forefathers. The Ramban right away jumps onto Rashi and says, what do you mean not include the story of our forefathers? There's so much that we learn from them. We learn how to behave as Jews, we learn all of Jewish history, and most importantly, we learn the idea of Maisa Avos Siman Labanim, which means that the actions of our forefathers are a harbinger for future generations. So really, this is one of the most important sessions we'll have in All Back to the Past, because by understanding the lives of our forefathers, you will come to an understanding of really all of Jewish history, because we see it all happening to our forefathers. We see it happen to them. It's just repeated time and time again. And it starts really right at the beginning, because Abraham is not exactly born into a tranquil time period. He's born into really a tyrannical time period. There's tyrants in the world. They're fighting for power. They're vying for power. Idolatry is rampant. Paganism is rampant. And the emperor of the world, if you will, is a man by the name of Nimrod. Nimrod, if you look just in the Chumash, just in the Jewish Bible, there's nothing really wrong with him per se. He's called Gibor Tzad. He's called a tough warrior. But our sages tell us a different story. Our sages basically paint a picture not that dissimilar to that of Stalin, of Hitler, Yamach Shemo, of the different tyrants that have taken place throughout world history. And that's the world that Abraham's born into. Abraham is the son of Terach, as we know from the Bible. We know that from the Torah. What we don't know from the Torah is who his mother is. Torah never tells us his mother's name. But the Talmud tells us her name. Don't worry. Her name is Amasya Bas Karnavo. And that's one of those fun stories you can ask people to party. Like, hey, who was Abraham's mother? And people say, I don't know. And now you know it's Amasya Bas Karnavo. So if that's all you learned tonight, you can thank your mother for having you, because you can answer these strange trivia questions. I'm sure they're watching. It's going to be on Jeopardy next week. But now you know it, and you heard it here on Back to the Past. But that's Abraham's parents. And Terach is he is not only an idol worshiper, he is in the business of making idols. He's an idol developer. How's business? Thank God's. That's the business he's in. And this is what Abraham's born into. So for the first 1 year of his life, 2 years of life, Abraham's a baby. He has no choice. Our sages tell us already at the age of 3, when he is able to start to communicate, to discern things, to understand things, already he understands there's a creator in the world. Already he understands that these idols are somewhat worthless, and he starts his journey at that point, at the age of 3. Now, it's not so easy, because if he's living in this world dominated by idolatry, dominated by imperialism, dominated by these dictators, and they're all pagans, and all of a sudden you have this little boy walking around saying, well, the idols aren't really true, the idols are meaningless, they don't really mean anything. How well do you think that's going to go for him? And needless to say, it doesn't go very well. So right in the midst of this, as Abraham is a 45-year-old or a 48-year-old monotheist, been a monotheist for 45 years old, that's when the Tower of Babel happens. So this battle that we talked about last week, where all the people of the world come together to try and build this tower, so to speak, to take on the Almighty, and their punishment is they're dispersed throughout the world. Abraham sees that. He sees that as an adult. He sees that as a 48-year-old adult. And all these have an effect on him. They have a very profound effect on him. So much so that where is Abraham when the Tower of Babel happens? So according to our sages, he's in jail. He's in jail already because Nimrod already locked him up. Now, how do we know that? We know that because his trial, so to speak, his death sentence, which was the sentence that was given to him, comes to a head in the Jewish year 1998 that corresponds to 1763 before the Common Era. At this point, Nimrod, the emperor of the world, says, you know what, Abraham, enough's enough. You've been sitting in jail for all these years. Let's see what you're all about. Come to my court. We're going to talk to you a little bit about your God. So you say your God controls everything. My God is a God of fire. I'm going to bet you that my God is more powerful than your God. And you know how I'm going to do it? I'm going to throw you into this fiery furnace. Abraham gets thrown into the furnace. He walks out, brushes off the ashes, takes a bow. And at that point, everyone realizes Abraham is for real. That's in the Jewish year 1998. There's only one problem. If you're the emperor of the world, and now he's 50 years old, some 50-year-old guy just basically throws a thorn in the side of your polytheistic religion, do you think you're going to make his life easy, or do you think that you're going to make it difficult? And not only that, but if you're the populace, you hear this message that this guy Abraham stands up to Nimrod and he survives, well, Abraham all of a sudden is going to get a great platform for that. You know, when you stand up to these tyrannical people, and if you make it, you become pretty famous. I mean, just look at Nelson Mandela, look at, in a Jewish example, Natan Sharansky. It makes you famous, and that's very much what Abraham was in his day. Everyone knew about him, everyone wanted to meet him, but there's one person who wanted to get rid of him, and sure enough, that was Nimrod. And he knew he couldn't get rid of him by throwing him into a fiery furnace, so he just makes his life absolutely miserable. So much so that 2 years after he's thrown into the furnace, Abraham's father, Terach, who's still alive at that point, says, you know what? Enough's enough. Nimrod's making your life miserable. Let's get out of here. At that point, they lived in the city of Ur Kasdim. Ur Kasdim, according to most historians and archaeologists, is in the south of modern-day Iraq. And he leaves Ur Kasdim. This is Terach and Nahor, Abraham's older brother. His younger brother Haran had died at this point because he was also thrown into the furnace. Another story for another time. He didn't make it out because he wasn't on the level of Abraham. And they leave and they go to an area called Haran. Haran is in modern-day Turkey, and that's where they, so to speak, try and avoid the wrath of Nimrod. Now, already in the year 2003 of the Jewish years, this corresponds to 1758 before the Common Era, Abraham makes his first trip to Canaan. Again, the big point here is that God still hasn't spoken to Abraham. Abraham has not gotten his first prophecy. So everything up until this point, he's discovered God. He's taught this idea of monotheism to the masses. He smashed all his father's idols. He sat in jail for 10 years. He was thrown into a fiery furnace. All this, and God still hasn't spoken to him. But Abraham comes to his understanding just through looking at the world. There's an innate understanding of the world, that there has to be a creator, and he can figure out what that creator expects from him. So already in the Jewish year 2003, he makes his first trip to Eretz Canaan. He makes his first trip to the land of Israel because he knows there's something special about that. And while he's there, 15 years after he gets there, that's finally when his first prophecy comes. It's known as the Bris Bein HaBesarim, the covenant between the parts, so called because during this time period, Abraham is told to bring these sacrifices, to split them in half, to walk in between them. And God basically tells him what he's signing up for. He says, Abraham, you've done a good job so far. You believe in me. You taught the idea of monotheism to the masses. But it's not going to be easy because you're going to, the first thing that's going to happen is your children are going to be strangers in a land that's not theirs for 400 years. They're going to be afflicted. They're going to be slaves. And hey, if that's not enough, after they get out, we're going to bring them to the land of Israel. They'll be there for roughly 800 years, give or take 70 years in the middle. And after that, and while they're going to be tormented by the Babylonians in between two stays in the land. They're going to be tormented by the Persians, by the Medes. They're going to be tormented by the Greeks. And that's not enough. I'm going to throw them into a very long exile for, at this point, we're at 2,000 years, roughly, for 2,000 years at the hand of the Romans and their successors. So, you want to sign up, Abraham? And after all this, Abraham says, you know what? It doesn't sound easy, but this is the truth. And therefore, I'm going to follow the truth, and I'm going to be your main guy. I'm signing up for all of this. And that's what's known as the Bris Bein Basarim. Now, interestingly enough, I believe we mentioned this last week, there's a concept of Ein Mutim Mucha Torah. There's no chronology in the Torah. So therefore, you'll look at events in the Torah, and they will not necessarily be in the order of how we're doing it here in Back to the Past. Because since this is a history class, we're putting them into chronological order. But interestingly enough, the covenant between the parts takes place in the Torah at the end of Parshas Lech Lecha, which is when Abraham was 70, and at the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha, Abraham was 75. So there are two stories that take place in the Torah out of order. Whole discussion as to why that is. Maybe we'll get into that another time. But be it as it may, Abraham is 70 at the time of the covenant between the parts, and shortly after that time period, he goes back to his father in the land of Haran. But he's not going to be there very long, because 5 years after he gets there, at the age of 75, we have our second prophecy to Abraham. And that is when God says to him, Lech lecha, me'artzecha, u'mimoladetecha, me'beis avicha, ad ha'makom asher areka, right? Until the place that I show you. And what's going on over there? So what happens is, you can ask the question. He already left Ur Kasdim when he was born. He already has been back and forth between the land of Canaan and the land of Haran. So what exactly is God telling him? God is giving him the next step in his journey. God says to him, Abraham, if you want to be my prophet, if you want to be my guy, you got to separate from everything beforehand. I'm sure your father Terach is a wonderful guy and took good care of you and brought you this far, but now you're 75 years old. It's time to go out. Time to go out on your own. Time to do your own thing. Time to come to the land of Canaan and start building the Jewish people. So he leaves everything. He leaves his father, he leaves his family, he leaves them all. As far as we know, he never has contact with them again. And God says, I'm going to make you into a great nation. Yet the first few things that happen to him there are tremendously tumultuous. First of all, he gets to the land of Israel. As soon as he gets there, there's famine. He can't stay there. He has to go down to Egypt. While he's in Egypt, his wife Sarah gets abducted by the Pharaoh down there. He manages to get her back unharmed, unscathed. They're able to make it back to the land of Israel, to the land of Canaan. And right when he gets there, there's a war that breaks out. There's a war that breaks out, a major world war between the 4 kings and the 5 kings. Now it's interesting, because this is essentially the First World War. And originally Abraham stays out of it, because that's really, again, that Maisa Avos Siman Labanim, the idea of the actions of our forefathers being a harbinger for us. That when there's these major events going on in the world, we don't want to be involved with them. We try and stay out, partially because you never know who the victor is going to be, and they're always going to blame it on the Jews if you're involved. So we try and stay completely out of it. Yet nonetheless, in the end, Abraham gets dragged into it, as so often happens to our people. Because what happens is his nephew Lot gets captured. And he gets a message that his nephew's been captured, therefore getting dragged into the war. And somehow he becomes the difference in the war. The war, there's different accounts as to how long it lasts. Some people say it lasts up to 26 years, starting right when he got back from Egypt for the next 26 years. And he fights the war, and he's the difference in the war. He makes the difference on the side of the 5 kings, therefore successful. He gets Lot back. One of the kings involved in that war was Melchizedek, who was the king of Jerusalem, or Shalem as it was called at that time, Salem, and like Winston-Salem in New York. And he's successful. So my Rebbe, Reb Bullman, made the point that the main sign we see from this for future generations, is whenever there's something major going on in the world, there's always going to be a Jew in the middle of it. Because here you had the First World War. Abraham had nothing to do with it, didn't want anything to do with it, tried to stay out of it, and sure enough, he ends up right in the middle of it. And that's Jewish history, for better or for worse. I mean, it's impossible, I think, to take the New York Times and to open it up and not find something about Israel or a Jew right there on the front page every day of the year. Someone should actually do a study, like how often does it happen? I would argue that it probably happens, every day, or almost every day, if not every day. But that's what happens, and he is the difference in the war. And then after the war, he's able to settle in the land of Canaan. Now, he spends the rest of his life at this point in the land of Canaan, but it's still not a simple life, because the thing that is weighing on him the most is here he's told he's going to build this great nation, and there's only one problem, and that is he has no children. So how in the world are you going to build a great nation if you don't have any children? So Avram and Sarah are trying to come up with ideas on what to do. Come up with the idea of Abraham taking Hagar as a wife. Now, who was Hagar? Hagar was Sarah's maidservant, but she was more than just a maidservant. She was a daughter of the princess. She was a daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. When Abraham and Sarah went down there because of the famine, Hagar was so impressed with what she saw from Avram and Sarah and from the lessons of monotheism that she gave up the royalty that she had in Alexandria or Cairo, or wherever it was, and she said, you know what, I'd rather be with Avram and Sarah. Better that I should be a maidservant in the house of Sarah than be a princess in the house of the Pharaoh. And that's where she came from. She was complete aristocracy, but she believed in what Avram and Sarah were all about, so much so that she gave up everything to be a part of it. And our sages tell us that she was not only a maidservant, that she was the main disciple of Sarah, that she went to Sarah to learn spirituality, to learn prophecy, to learn the ideas of monotheism. This is why she came. So it made sense that if they were going to try and have a child from someone who wasn't Sarah, that Hagar was the next best option. There's only one problem. Hagar actually she conceives right away. She becomes a little haughty about it. She acts as if she's better than Sarah. And Sarah says, 1 second, if you think you're better than me, then I have nothing to teach you anymore. I have nothing to teach you, and I can't teach you the ways of monotheism. I can't teach you the ways of spirituality. You have to leave my house. So she leaves. And our sages tell us that while she left, she actually miscarried. And the angel comes and says, you know what? You have to go back, because what you're going to learn there is better than we can learn anywhere else, and you have to make this work. And don't worry, you're going to conceive again while you're there. And she goes back, she conceives again, and the baby she has is Ishmael. This is the year 2034 in the Jewish year, and this is when Yishmael is born. Ishmael is born. Now, Ishmael is a very complicated person, and in many ways, it's the first years of his life are difficult, because we're going to see that right after he is born, Abraham is given 13 years after he's born, when he's 13 years old, Abraham is given the commandment to circumcise himself and to circumcise his whole entire household. And by the way, this is the days before modern anesthesia. I don't think they had anesthetics back then, so it probably is not a pleasant thing. And therefore, Yishmael has to be circumcised along with Abraham. And shortly after that, after the circumcision takes place, that's the year 2047, that's when Abraham finally gets the prophecy. They're going to have a child, not only Yishmael, but you're going to have a child from Sarah. You're going to have a child that will be your progenitor. So that child is born, and that child is Yitzchak. It's in unbelievable circumstances, because at the time that Yitzchak is born, Abraham is 100 years old, Sarah is 90 years old, and this is after the flood, after the world has changed, so to speak, where nature is more like we have it today, where people only live to be around 120 years old. So when they're told they're going to have a baby, Abraham laughs, I'm an old man. Sarah laughs, she laughs because she's an old woman. She laughs because Abraham's an old man. A whole discussion over there of what happened. And nonetheless, they have their miracle baby. They have their baby Yitzchak. Now, Hagar, so to speak, learned the lesson of not just because she had a baby first that she wasn't so much better than Sarah. But Yishmael didn't really learn this lesson, and unfortunately goes in the ways of his mother and starts taunting Yitzchak. Says, "You think you're the real son? I'm the real son. You got circumcised at 8 days. I got circumcised at 13 years old. Really, I'm the real son over here. It's not you." And Sarah says, "You know what? This isn't working with Yishmael and Hagar. I think they have to go away. He's being a bad influence on Yitzchak. We already know Yitzchak's the progenitor. We got to send them away." And God says to Avraham, who doesn't want to send them away, says, Sarah knows, her prophecy is greater than you. She knows that this isn't good for our people. Send them away. So Yishmael and Hagar are sent away. Now it's interesting, because that's really the last we hear of Yishmael in the Chumash. But But we know that, I'm sorry, that's not the last, that's the second to last time we hear of Yishmael in the Chumash. We're going to hear of him again when Avram passes away, that he comes to the funeral of Abraham. And we taught a very significant lesson over there, because when it talks about the funeral procession, it says that Yitzchak and Yishmael buried Abraham. So our sages learned from there that Yishmael at that point allowed Yitzchak to walk in front of him, so to speak, to say, you know what, even though I'm older, even though I got circumcised at 13, even though all these ancient claims or old claims out against you, I know that you're the heir over here, you're the progenitor over here of the Jewish people. And he agreed to that. And therefore our sages say that Yishmael did tshuva. And from that point forward, Yishmael was really regarded as a holy person, as a son of Abraham, one who did tshuva, one who respected Yitzchak. And I'll prove it to you, because we're going to come across two famous Jews in later Jewish history with the name Yishmael. First of all, there's Rabbi Yishmael, who was one of the Tanaim, one of the rabbis in the Mishnah. And not only that, but before that even, when we talk about one of the assassinations, which we'll get to in a few sessions, the assassination of Gedaliah ben Achikam, Gedaliah is assassinated by a man named Yishmael ben Netanyahu. By the way, there's a lesson just in that name. I just haven't figured out what it is yet. Ishmael, the son of Netanyahu. Something's there. But he was a Jew, and even though he ended up being a murderer, he was born a plain old Jew, and he was given the name Yishmael, just like Rabbi Yishmael. And we know as Jews, we only give names of people who we honor. So we see that Ishmael was an honorable person, was regarded as an honorable person in Jewish history. Until when? Until Islam comes. Once we have the rise of Islam, and that's looked at as the religion of Yishmael, and there's all the struggles that we're going to have with our cousins, the descendants of Yishmael, at that point it becomes passé to name your kids Yishmael. So in 632, from that point on, we're not going to find any more Jewish Ishmaels. All Ishmaels from that point on are going to be Arabs, are going to be Muslims. But before that point, you do find Jewish Ishmaels, because in the end, Ishmael does do tshuva. He comes back to the ways of Abraham. Not as a progenitor, but at least as a descendant of Abraham. So we go on to Yitzchak. Yitzchak is one of the strangest, I don't know if strange is the right word, but one of the most mysterious characters in the whole entire Torah, because here he is one of our forefathers. We always talk about him as a forefather. When we pray, we say God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. We just had the holiday of Sukkot, where we have the Ushpizin, the exalted guest. One of those exalted guests is, sure enough, Yitzchak. Yet the Torah tells us almost nothing about him. We're told that he's born. We're told that he's weaned, that Abraham makes a party when he's weaned. We're told about the Akedah, about the binding of Isaac when he's 37 years old. The final test that God gives to Abraham is he's told to slaughter his one and only son, who he was told would be the progenitor. And Yitzchak, knowing what he has to do, goes along with it. It is one of the great acts of Jewish history. In the end, obviously, he's not slaughtered, or else we wouldn't be here, or we'd have other parents, I guess, or other grandparents. But nonetheless, that's what we're told. And I forgot, and I'm sorry, and then after the Akedah, we're told that he gets married. He marries Rivka, and we're told they have two children, Yaakov and Esav, and then we have the incident of the brachos. And that's it. That's it. Abraham gets Parshas Lech Lecha, Parshas Vayera, Parshas Chayesara, and Yaakov gets several Parshas after that, and then we have this little tiny bit. We don't know much about Yitzchak. It's a strange thing. But one thing we do know is that he represents what's called gevura. He represents what's called strength. Each of our patriarchs were given a midah, given a character trait that we're supposed to emulate. Abraham was ish chesed, was the man of kindness. Yitzchak was gevura, was strength. And that's really what he was. And that's represented in this act of the Akedah. So Isaac's 37 at the time of the Akedah, at the time of the binding of Isaac. He's brought up to Mount Moriah. It happens on Mount Moriah, the place where the temple would later stand, the place where we visit the Western Wall. He's bound. He knows he's supposed to be slaughtered. He knows it's supposed to be an offering, and he goes along with it. So much so that he tells his father to be sure to bind him well so that he shouldn't slip or get scared or run away. He is all in on this, so to speak. And in the end, God says, you know what? I didn't want you to slaughter him. I wanted to make sure, Abraham and Isaac, that you're willing to give up everything to build the Jewish people. And they showed that they were willing to give up everything. And that's what they did. Isaac survives, obviously, it goes on, but there's one person who doesn't come out of the Akedah unscathed, and that is Sarah. Sarah hears about this, and here's her baby that she had at the age of 90. He's 37 at the time, not much of a baby, And the whole relationship they're told of Yitzchak and Sarah talk about the Maisa Avosim and Labanim, the sign for the future generations. It's the ultimate Jewish mother relationship. We see so much so that when Sarah finds out about it, she dies just from hearing about it. We see that he's tremendously coddled. He was 37 years old at the time, and he hadn't left home yet, like many Jewish boys that we know. And not only that, we're going to see when we get up to the blessings, what's he ask for? He asked for yummy food, because that's what he was used to eating from his mother's household. So that's the relationship over here. And Sarah can't take the news of the Akedah. Even though he survives, she can't even wait to hear the end of the sentence. She hears that such a thing happened, and she drops dead at that point. To which Abraham has to do a very difficult thing, and that is buy the burial place for not only his wife, but really his life partner and everything that he did. We're told that in all his reaching out to people, that Abraham would reach out to the men, Sarah would reach out to the women, and Sarah was as all in on this as Abraham was. And Abraham has to go bury her. He's basically being swindled by Uriah Hitti. I'm sorry, not Uriah Hitti. I'm giving you the wrong name of. He buys the Marsal Chpeh, the cave of the Patriarchs, and Ephron Achiti. Thank you. It's a good thing I have people here who know things better than I do. Right, Uriah Hitti we get to much later with King David. Ephron Achiti, Ephron the Hittite, and who basically wants to take him for maximum dollar and to shake him down for as much money he can get. But nonetheless, he buys the cave of the Patriarchs. Now, what was so important about the cave of the Patriarchs was that Abraham had a tradition that that's where Adam and Eve were buried. So if that's the place where Adam and Eve were buried, he figured that's where I have to be buried, that's where Sarah has to be buried, and that's where my children have to be buried. And that was in the land, the city of Hebron, the city of Hebron. So it's interesting because the story plays itself out that Abraham goes to such extent to buy it at top dollar, because he wanted to make sure that no matter what, the burial place for him and his wife would not be disputed. There's only one problem. It's become one of the most disputed territories in all of Israel. Because what happens is when the descendants of Ishmael eventually start their own religion called Islam, they're going to say that it wasn't Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, and Adam and Eve that are buried in the cave of the patriarchs. No, it's Adam and Eve, they got that right. It's Abraham, they got that right, but then it's Hagar, it's Ishmael, it's Ishmael's wife, and Ishmael's children. That's who's buried there. And therefore, it becomes a place of much dissent throughout world history. Jews say it's theirs. We say it's ours. The Muslims say it's theirs, and that's what ends up happening with this place. So he buries his wife Sarah, and the next thing he does, he says it's time for my son to get married. So he sends his trusty servant Eliezer off to find a wife for Yitzchak. But he says, you know what? She can't come from around here. She can't come from the land of Canaan. You have to go back to my family. We see a very interesting thing with the building of the Jewish people. I mentioned before that Terach and Amaslai Bas Carnival couldn't have been too bad because they really build the Jewish people. Not only through Abraham, but we see that when Abraham marries off his children, they're always going back to the same family. Who does Abraham marry? Abraham marries Sarah, his niece. It's Harun's daughter, his brother Harun's daughter. Now it's time for Yitzchak to get married. Who does Yitzchak marry? Yitzchak marries Rivka. Rivka is Bethuel's daughter. Bethuel was Nachor's son, Abraham's other brother. And we're going to see that when it's time for Yitzchak to get, when it's time for Yaakov to get married, for Yitzchak's son to get married, it goes back to the same family, to the family of Lavan, who is Bethuel's son, from Nachor, from that same whole thing, because we are filtering out whatever was good in this family. Not only that, but before Mashiach comes, before the Messiah can come, or before the Davidic monarchy can start, we're going to need one more piece thrown into this, and that is Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth the Moabite comes from Moab. Moab was the son of Lot and his daughter, and that illicit relationship that took place between them, getting, if you will, the last piece of the puzzle from what we had to take out of Terach and his family to be able to build the Jewish people. So when Avram says it's time for my son to get married, it can't happen here. You have to go back to the family that's all supposed to come from. And he sends his trusty servant, Eliezer. He brings back Rivka. And the whole relationship of Rivka and Yitzchak is nothing like Sarah and Avram and Sarah. Like Avram and Sarah grew up together. They became frum together. They went to NCSY Shabbatons together. Like that's the life they lived together. when Rivka comes to Yitzchak, she literally falls off her horse because she can't believe that such a holy man is going to be her husband. And that's the relationship that they have. And we see that there's a communication breakdown constantly in their relationship, that Yitzchak can never understand that Rivka, in certain ways, has a higher level of prophecy than him. And that's represented in their children, because they have two children, Yaakov and Esav. Now, the original plan, if you will, for Yaakov and Esav was that they were supposed to be partners in all this. So there were supposed to be four patriarchs, if you will. It was supposed to be Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Esav. That was supposed to be the plan. And there's a line in Psalms that really sums up what their relationship was supposed to be. The line in Psalms says, Sur me'ra v'aseh tov, bakesh shalom v'radfehu. They were supposed to remove evil, do good, seek peace, and run after it. And that represented what Yaakov and Esau were supposed to do. Yaakov was supposed to be the Sur me'ra. He was supposed to be the one who was supposed to go in and remove evil wherever he would find it, and therefore Yaakov would be the Aseh Tov, would be the one to go in and to, so to speak, do the good when the evil was removed. Yeah, we have a question here from the crowd.
Yaakov was Sur me'ra?
No. Esau was Sur me'ra. Yaakov was Aseh Tov. So Esau was supposed to remove the evil, and Yaakov was supposed to do the good. But we're going to see that, unfortunately, and this is a common thing we see it time and time again, Jewish history and world history, that evil is like fire. You know, you can put it out, but it can burn you. And unfortunately, it burnt Esau from a young age. Esau right away gets taken into the ideas of idol worship, of murder, of illicit relationships, and he right away becomes disqualified. Not right away, but on the day that Abraham dies, actually becomes completely disqualified from being one of the progenitors of the Jewish people. So much that on that same day when our sages say he committed his first murder, that's the day that he even sells his birthright to Jacob. He says, what do I need this birthright for? It's worthless to me. And therefore saying, you know what? I'm out of here. And that's his whole view on things. Now, because of that, it's not enough for Esau just to fade into the limelight, so to speak. He's going to become the biggest antagonist of Yaakov throughout world history, because the Sur Me'ra completely overtakes him and completely reverses him to where throughout world history, it's going to be the descendants of Esau who are constantly at our throats. When we talk about the Roman Empire, we understand as Esau. If we talk about this concept of Amalek, that's Esau. When we talk about Hitler, Yamach Shemo, that's Esau. And that is something that we have to contend with from this point forward. But before it all happens, they're given blessings. Right? Yitzchak knows his life is coming to an end. He brings his sons in. He says, guys, I got to give you a blessing. Rivka knows that this is her chance, because she knows that she has to make the final stand, so to speak, against Yitzchak. In other words, don't think that Rivka did not try to convince Yitzchak that Esau was bad throughout their whole lives. Of course she did. But you know what? We're told that Esau was the biggest charlatan. He was constantly fooling his father. He would go in, he was very close with his father. He honored his father in a tremendous way. He would go in and ask his father questions of Jewish law, trying to pretend like he was pious. And Yitzchak really thought that he was pious. Rivka said, Yitzchak, honey, you don't see through this son of ours. He's not pious. He's not what you think he is. To which Yitzchak says, you can't fool me. I'm a prophet. You can't fool someone who has prophecy. I know I'm right. So how does Rivka make the point to Yitzchak finally? She fools him. As if to say, you think you can't fool a prophet? You know what I'm going to do? If I can't convince you that all these years Esau has been trying to make you think he's as good as Yaakov, I'm going to show you that I can make you believe that Yaakov is Esau. And that's what she does at the time of the blessings. She goes through a whole scheme with Yaakov to try and prove to Yitzchak that he's really Esau, therefore getting the blessing of Esau. They pull it off without a hitch, almost without a hitch. And then Esau comes in and says, Dad, I'm here to get my blessing. At that point, Yitzchak realizes what happened. He says, you know what? Rivka was right. I had been fooled all along. And I almost went along with it and made you the heir, made you the progenitor of the Jewish people. I know where you're holding. But don't worry, Esau, I'm going to make a deal with you. You're not going to be left with nothing. Yaakov is going to be my heir. But you're going to have a special relationship here. An infamous relationship, if you will. Because every time Yaakov is down, you'll be up. And whenever Yaakov is up, you'll be down. And if you look through our world history, at least thus far in world history, Esau's fared much better than us. Because every time we're down, Esau's there to be on top. And our sages actually criticize Yitzchak for this. They say they gave Esau, if you will, the carte blanche to torment Yaakov throughout history. As if to say, when he's down and not doing what he's supposed to, you have to remind him of that. And that's all the anti-Semitism and pogroms and everything that we've seen throughout history, coming right there at the hands of our first cousin, Esau. Now, just a little bit of the backdrop of what's going on here in the world. We mentioned that Abraham came into a very tyrannical, imperialistic world. At the time, really, of Yitzchak and Yaakov, the world had settled down to a certain extent. The Canaanites had already taken up residency in the land of Israel. They had built their Canaanite kingdoms. And Egypt was starting to develop as a world power. Egypt won't fully come on the scene as a world power until the time of Yosef, until the time of the famine, which we'll get to a little bit more next week. But that's what we see already happening in the world. The Canaanites are strong in the land of Israel. The Egyptians are waiting in the wings, but they're getting ready for at the time of the great famine. And that's the world that we're in right now. Now, after this time period of the stealing of the blessings, Yaakov fears for his life. And his mother says, you got to run away because Esau's going to kill you. So he runs away. But before he runs away, and by the way, what's he run away to do? He runs away to get married. At this point, by the way, he's not a young man. He is in his 60s already, 63 years old when he leaves. Not married yet, right? So getting a little bit older. Abraham and Sarah, by the way, got married a lot younger. They're the youngest of the crew. They got married in the year 1973 of the Jewish years when he was 35 years old. That's when he got married. Now we saw that Yitzchak gets married when he's 37, also about the same age, but Yaakov waits a lot longer. He's going to be 77 before he gets married. And before he goes off to try and find his wife, he says, I have to fortify myself spiritually. And he goes to a place called the Yeshiva Shem the Aver, the Yeshiva Shem in Eber. This is Shem, the son of Noah. Aver was Shem's grandson. They built an institution of monotheism, and they taught monotheism not to the world, but they taught for everyone who would come. It was an ivory tower, if you will. They didn't go out to anybody, but if you wanted to come, you could learn monotheism. And this yeshiva of Shem and Aver, that's where Abraham studied, that's where Yitzchak studied, and that's where Yaakov's going to study for 14 years before he goes to the land of Lavan, back to the land of Haran, to marry his wives, Rachel and Leah. Now you can ask the question, why do you have to marry two wives? A very strange story over there. But from what we said before, it makes perfect sense. Because we mentioned that Yaakov and Esau were supposed to be partners. They were supposed to be the partners of building the Jewish people. And therefore, if Yaakov and Esau were supposed to be the partners, it only made sense that they were supposed to marry Rachel and Leah. That's why we have this whole concept of Leah having droopy eyes because she was crying, because everyone said she was going to be the one to marry Esau, because they knew that they were going to build together. But you knew that Esau was out of the picture. So once Esau goes out of the picture, we need to have a way for Rachel and Leah, who are supposed to be that piece of the creation of the Jewish people, we have to have a way for it to happen. And the only way that can happen is for Yaakov to marry both of them. Now it has to happen through a scheme because Yaakov doesn't realize he has to marry both of them. And not to mention, Yaakov doesn't want to marry both of them because Yaakov has that innate understanding of the world, and that innate understanding, we're told that our sages had such an innate understanding of the world that they followed the whole entire Torah before it was given. So it says in the Torah, you can't marry two sisters. So therefore, Yaakov didn't want to marry two sisters, and it took this strange scheming of his his father-in-law Lavan to make the whole thing happen, but that was necessary to build the Jewish people because both Rachel and Leah have to come into the Jewish people to build the Jewish people. And next week when we continue, we will see that process of going from a family. Until this point, we're just a family. We're Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We filtered out Yishmael. We filtered out Esav. Next week, we're going to see Jacob, together with his wife, is going to have a total of 4 wives in the end, that they are going to build a nation together, and that will be the beginning of the nation. The nation is called by Yitzchak's name. It's called by Yaakov's name. Yaakov's name will be changed to Yisrael, and that has been our name until this day. We're the Bnei Yisrael. Our home is called the land of Israel because that is who we are. So the next step in all this will be the transformation from being a family to being a nation. Any questions before we wrap it up? From a massive crowd we have here today. Any questions online from anyone who's viewing this on Facebook? Okay, if you have any questions on the road, by the way, feel free to just come right back here on Facebook. It'll be posted here. You can put your questions in the comment box and we'll get back to you. If you want to follow this later, you can follow this on YouTube or on the podcast. The podcast has not officially been launched yet because it hasn't been approved by Apple, but it will be launched shortly, and you'll be able to listen to it there. And this will remain posted on Facebook as well to watch over here. We'll continue next week with the creation of the nation, with the beginning of the development of the Jewish people from being a family to being a nation. I thank you all for coming. I thank you for participating and for listening.